The Netherlands had just been liberated from the Nazis and immediately started a colonial war of its own in Indonesia. Dutch troops achieved success. Cities fell, leaders were arrested, and on paper the Republic seemed defeated, and yet the Netherlands lost. Not militarily but politically. Soon a persistent narrative emerged, the so-called stab in the back legend. Soldiers claimed that their own government had betrayed them, that politicians, international pressure, and weak policy had thrown away a victory. But is that a truth or a myth to hide a painful reality? It was 1948. The Netherlands had already been trying for several years to reconquer Indonesia. The war had effectively begun after the Japanese surrender in August 1945. After that, the Indonesian nationalist leaders declared independence. The first phase of the Indonesian War of Independence began from August 1945, right after the Japanese capitulation and the subsequent declaration of independence, and lasted until the Lincoln-Jati Agreement and the British withdrawal at the end of 1946. During this period, Indonesian armed forces were rapidly built up, while the Netherlands had hardly any military presence in the region, because the Netherlands had just been liberated and still had to reorganize its army, and many Dutch colonial soldiers were weakened or had even died in Japanese captivity. British troops temporarily took control. They were tasked with disarming Japanese soldiers and evacuating Dutch civilians from internment camps. However, they too soon became entangled in the conflict. This phase became known for its extreme violence, with events such as the Bersia period and the Battle of Surabaya. The second phase, from November 46 to August 47, was characterized by rising tensions, continuous skirmishes, and the gradual collapse of the Lincoln-Jati Agreement. Dutch troops expanded their influence and eventually launched a major offensive, Operation Product. Although this resulted in military success and brought large parts of Java and Sumatra under Dutch control, Indonesian resistance was not broken. In the third phase, from August 47 to December 48, the Netherlands attempted to consolidate its gains and restore order. Meanwhile, Indonesian fighters switched to guerrilla tactics, against which the Dutch approach proved ineffective. At the same time, the international position of the Indonesian Republic improved, partially due to political developments such as the Renville Agreement and the suppression of the Madiun Uprising. Without broad support among the population and under increasing pressure, the Netherlands ultimately felt compelled to launch a second major offensive at the end of 1948. Operation Kraai in Dutch had a different objective than Operation Product. This time, the capital of the Indonesian Republic, Yogyakarta, was attacked and the political leaders of the Republic were captured. On December 19th, 1948, this operation began, marking the final and bloodiest phase of the War of Independence. This time, the Chief of Staff of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army and the Royal Dutch Army in the Indies, General Simon Spoor, was allowed to advance on Yogyakarta, where the political leadership of the Republic allowed itself to be taken prisoner. The military leadership of the Indonesian Armed Forces and the bulk of the TNI, the forces of the Indonesian Republic, managed to escape. Unlike Operation Product, this operation was less surprising, as Indonesian resistance had by now become better organized. Under heavy international pressure from the United Nations, the offensive was halted on January 5th. On paper, the Netherlands had at that moment occupied all of Java and strategically important parts of Sumatra. The operation cost 113 Dutch lives, while more than 3,000 Indonesians were killed on Java alone. After the offensive, a stalemate once again emerged. Dutch troops carried out large-scale clearing operations supported by artillery, the Special Forces Corps, and the Air Force. Outside the cities, however, Dutch authority remained extremely fragile and was contested by the TNI as well as other armed groups. Violence escalated. The number of Dutch fatalities rose from 34 to 155 per month, while Indonesian casualties, according to Dutch figures, reached 46,800 due to a shortage of experienced soldiers, the dispersal across thousands of isolated outposts, and constant danger along the so-called death roads. The Dutch strategy of pacification became increasingly ineffective. Violence, intimidation, and counter-terror intensified, while local Republican shadow administrations emerged. Shortly before his death in April 1949, Army Commander Spoor remained optimistic about the success of Dutch operations, although he now estimated that pacification would take 18 months instead of a few. The cabinet in The Hague was far more pessimistic. Under international pressure, negotiations with the Republic were resumed, leading to the Roem van Rooyen Agreement and a ceasefire on May 7th. On June 22nd, the Dutch evacuated Jakarta, a moment that would later become the foundation of the infamous stab in the back myth. Spoor died a few weeks later after suffering a heart attack, exhausted from his work. Sukarno returned to Jakarta in early July. A final ceasefire was proclaimed on August 10th for Java and August 14th for Sumatra. Eventually, near the end of 1949, the transfer of sovereignty took place, ending Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, with the exception of Papua New Guinea. That's another story, because we are focusing on this question. Could the Dutch have won the war, or was it doomed from the start? Prior to the large-scale Dutch actions in November 1945, the Lieutenant Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, Hubertus van Mook, stated that he needed 75,000 men. A year later, however, he requested 100,000 men to bring Java and Sumatra under Dutch control. A Dutch military officer warned that a military solution would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. His name was Wybrandus Schilling. Now a general major, he had earlier fought in Aceh. He warned that the troops of the Indonesian Republic were far stronger than expected. While they lacked in experience, they compensated for with high morale. Schilling estimated that for Java alone, 200,000 men would be needed and that the war could last up to 10 years. He presented the following to his government. Can the Dutch population of only 8 million, which suffered so much during the German invasion, endure the drain on human and material resources required to wage a war of reconquest of a scale and duration outlined in the previous analysis? A war of a scale never before seen in our colonial history. Look, before the Japanese occupation, Dutch colonial authority was still firmly in control. The colonial state possessed an effective military apparatus against local uprisings, including an air force, armored vehicles, and an organized communications network. Indonesia was not yet a cohesive national unit. The archipelago consisted of hundreds of ethnic groups, diverse cultures, different religions, and an infrastructure poorly suited for rapid communication across long distances. The idea of Indonesia as a single political community was emerging, but far from deeply rooted. The colonial state benefited from this diversity by playing groups against each other or bilingual elites through indirect rule. It was the Japanese who shattered this system. Their overthrow of colonial authority and mass mobilization of the Indonesian population during the occupation were decisive for the post-war period. Indonesia is, by the way, the fourth largest coffee producer in the world, accounting for 5 to 7% of global production. Why am I telling you this? Well, you can support this channel by buying me a coffee via buymeacoffee.com. That way you support the channel and help me continue making history videos. See the link in the pinned comment. Please like, comment, share this video and subscribe if you haven't already. After the Japanese easily defeated the Dutch forces in the East Indies, they dismantled Dutch institutions. The Dutch literally disappeared from the streets as they were interned in the notorious Japanese internment camps. At the same time, Japan mobilized the Indonesian population. Indonesians were trained in discipline and weapons use, skills that later proved crucial in the fight against the Dutch. This was done through various organizations such as HIHO and PITA. Hundreds of thousands of Indonesians were drilled by using anti-imperialistic rhetoric aimed at ending centuries of colonial rule. Through both militarization and brutalization during the occupation, many Indonesians, especially on Java and Sumatra, were ecstatic when independence was proclaimed by their leader Sukarno. Writer David van Rijbroek spoke with an Indonesian eyewitness and wrote in his book Revolutie. Once you understand that, you understand much better why the people of Indonesia were so opposed to the return of either one. Free of everything, shouted 95-year-old Tournowo Hidibidjojo in Dutch when asked him about his motivation for taking up arms. He was hard of hearing and articulated it extremely clear. Vrij van alles. Yes, that more or less summed it up. And with that, it can be said that the genie was out of the bottle. Before World War II, Dutch authority had still been firmly in control and potential troublemakers had been imprisoned or exiled. Now the Netherlands faced an entire population of hundreds of thousands of insurgents who were determined not to return to Dutch rule. What followed was asymmetrical warfare. At its core, asymmetrical warfare is a conflict between two sides using completely different military means and tactics. On one side stood the Netherlands with a conventional army equipped with tanks, artillery and air power. Their strategy focused on capturing key areas, such as major cities and economically important plantations, assuming that control over power centers would lead to a quick victory. On the other side stood the young Indonesian Republic, which knew it could not win a direct confrontation. Instead, it adopted guerrilla tactics. Indonesian fighters retreated into difficult terrain, mountains and jungles where Dutch advantages were neutralized. Rather than defending cities, they often abandoned them, striking from the shadows with a hit-and-run attack. They targeted convoys, destroyed infrastructure, and disappeared before the Dutch could respond. Local population support was crucial, as guerrillas blended into the civilian population for intelligence and supplies. This asymmetry created a situation where the Netherlands won almost every battle but never gained full control. Dutch soldiers were constantly on the edge against an invisible enemy, which severely affected morale. In the end, it was not defeat on the battlefield, but the political unsustainability of this war that forced the Netherlands to recognize Indonesian independence. Historian Remy Limpach noted in Burning Campox of General Spoor, one of the biggest mistakes made by those in charge was underestimating the enemy. Even during the bloody conquest of the archipelago by the KNAL, which at first glance seemed to have been largely completed, with the difficult and never definitive victory in the Aceh War, the military leadership continued to assume that the enemy was an inferior native or indigenous opponent. The authorities displayed this contemptuous attitude again during the reconquest of Indonesia after the Japanese surrender in 1945. But what about the outcome after Operation Crow? The Netherlands had captured the Republic's stronghold and arrested its leaders, among which Sukarno. For Dutch soldiers in the field, this felt like the final blow. They believed they had finally won the war. That euphoria turned into disbelief and anger when the international community, led by the United Nations and the UN Security Council, condemned the Netherlands. Under the threat of losing martial aid, the Dutch government was forced to withdraw and release Republican leaders. To soldiers who had lost comrades taking Yogyakarta, this was incomprehensible. They saw a defeated enemy being restored by politics. Yet, even without this, the TNI resistance had not been destroyed. Outside cities, Dutch authority remained fragile. Violence and casualties even increased after Operation Crow. Dutch pacification had become a dead end. Troop shortages, a shrinking budget, and an unsustainable strategy. In the end, the war was not winnable for the Netherlands. Instead of clinging so rigidly to the colonial rule, Before World War II, the Dutch might have conceded more to Indonesian demands for autonomy and tried to win hearts and minds, but that simply did not align with colonial thinking in the 1920s and 1930s. By the time Japan surrendered, the situation had fundamentally changed. Pacification was, in hindsight, an impossible task. Wibrande Schilling had already seen it, but he was ignored. The result? Hundreds of thousands of Indonesian deaths, thousands of Dutch casualties, immense material damage, and a severely damaged reputation for the Netherlands. Yet, unrest did not stop after 1949. If you want to learn more on that, click right here. Thanks for watching. Until next time.